Story 1. My daughter died on her honeymoon. At the funeral, her husband's words made me freeze. Because my daughter had. Why? How could this happen? For days after my beloved daughter left for her honeymoon, I was suddenly informed that she had died in an accident, just when she had found a good person and was about to start a happy life. During the funeral, her husband was also crying, saying he couldn't regret it enough. However, I felt something odd about one of his statements. Something was off. Could it be murder? With an uneasy feeling in my chest, I began investigating the incident that took my daughter's life, not knowing that the truth would plunge me into despair. I had raised my daughter Taylor alone since losing my husband to an accident when I was young. She was my pride and joy, honest, straightforward, and devoted to her parents. Since I had been a single parent and caused her some hardships, I was truly delighted when she introduced me to a man, her marriage partner Harry. Harry seemed like a serious person. His parents had already passed away, and he had no siblings, claiming to be completely alone in the world. At first, I had the impression that he was a fine young man, with a refreshing appearance and seemingly flawless character. What? You're not having a wedding ceremony? My daughter looked very displeased when she told me this. Harry said he doesn't like flashy or conspicuous things, and it's a waste of money to just register the marriage. But didn't you say you wanted to wear a wedding dress? My daughter is a girl after all, so she must have wanted to wear that once-in-a-lifetime attire. However, at this point, a disagreement with Harry had emerged. He says he wants to splurge on the honeymoon with the money we save. He really wants to go on an overseas trip. I see. Indeed, if they wanted to have a decent-sized wedding ceremony and enjoy an overseas trip, it would be quite expensive. However, I thought it was inappropriate not to listen to any of my daughter's wishes. They could have a domestic trip, or if they insisted on going abroad, they could look for cheaper options. Surely Harry could compromise somewhere. I felt uneasy thinking that Taylor was being taken lightly, but I didn't want their relationship to sour at this point, so I decided to invite them both to my home. Hey, is it okay if I try to persuade Harry? After getting my daughter's permission, I arranged to speak directly with Harry. Harry, I want you to listen to this as my selfish desire to see my daughter in her wedding attire. Couldn't you at least have a wedding ceremony just for the photos? But I really want to make the honeymoon special. For him who has no parents, it might not sit well to have me taking Taylor's side as a parent figure. However, it's said that dissatisfaction with marriage and childbirth can last a lifetime. Besides, it shouldn't be wrong to bring in a little parental desire to fulfill my daughter's wish. I spoke as carefully and amicably as possible, trying not to offend him. We'll include Taylor's favorite activity, diving, in the plan, but it's quite popular, so it's quite expensive. Is that so? That sounds fun. In that case, I'll pay for all the wedding photo costs. Consider it a wedding gift. How's that? Really? That's great. Thank you so much. I'm happy that I'll get to see Taylor looking beautiful too. The moment I said I'd cover the costs, his expression brightened, and I couldn't help but give a wry smile. Is he unexpectedly stingy? Although I felt a bit uneasy about the future, at least this way we could have a photo wedding. My daughter got to wear about 3 dresses she liked. Once we started, Harry seemed to get into it too, not complaining about changing outfits or moving to different locations. In the end, it seemed to become a good memory for both of them, so I was glad I had persuaded them. The day after taking lots of great photos and having a small dinner party, my daughter and her husband left for their honeymoon in Australia. I'll bring back lots of souvenirs. That was the last time I heard my daughter's voice. What? What did you say? I suddenly received a call from someone claiming to be the local police, telling me that my daughter had died. This happened just 4 days after Taylor and Harry had left. They said my daughter had drowned while diving. Apparently, the day before they were to go into the sea, my daughter had sprained her ankle while sightseeing in another location. Despite this, she insisted on going into the water because she had been looking forward to it so much. The person on the phone seemed to have changed from the police to Harry at some point, but honestly, I don't remember much about that moment. When I came to my senses, only Harry had returned. My daughter's remains had been brought to the funeral home, and I was holding Taylor's memorial portrait, and I was receiving condolences from the funeral attendees. It was then that I felt like I could finally face what was happening in front of me. Perhaps because I was like this, or maybe because he was feeling the same way, Harry hardly spoke to me until the funeral. Thank you all for attending my wife's funeral today. Harry was addressing the microphone. but his voice was flat, almost mechanical. However, as he began to describe the circumstances of my daughter's death, Harry's voice started to tremble. Finally, he began to sob, his words becoming fragmented. No one would expect things to turn out like this when they were about to start a happy life together. Of course, he'd react that way, huh? Wait a minute. Harry's speech was a typical eulogy, if you just let it wash over you, but I noticed something odd about it. During breaks in the funeral, I had the chance to talk with my daughter's friends who had attended, and I found something else puzzling there too. Her friends were all saying things like, "I didn't know Taylor had gotten married, and this is the first time I've seen Taylor's husband." Surprisingly, Taylor and Harry hadn't told anyone about their marriage registration, and they didn't have a single friend in common. Were they planning to announce it after they got the photos? But is it normal for no one to know? Harry, although there were quite a few attendees at the funeral, it struck me as odd that none of Harry's acquaintances were among them. But I thought the only way to resolve these nagging doubts was to talk to Harry directly. However, the conversation took a dramatic turn shortly after this due to the testimony of a certain person attending this funeral. It was 2 weeks later that I contacted Harry. By this time, he must have been busy dealing with Taylor's belongings and insurance paperwork. "I still have some of Taylor's insurance documents at my house. I'm sorry to trouble you, but could you come pick them up?" When I said this, Harry came right over. "Hello, Mother. Where are the documents?" As Harry said this, a large fist connected with his face. Harry's body seemed to float in the air for a moment before being slammed to the floor with the same momentum. Harry could only look confused as he held his struck face. No wonder my niece and Harry's brother, Anthony, had been waiting in the guest room. "I've finally found you, you stupid little brother. How dare you deceive my aunt and cousin?" So this is what it was. I was right to trust my instinct at that time. What's going on? Why is my brother here? During the funeral, I had sensed something odd about Harry's eulogy. Now, the source of that oddity became clear. That day, Harry had tearfully told the attendees, "My wife attempted to climb Ayers Rock the day before diving." He said she had lost her footing and sprained her ankle, which is why she couldn't swim well and drowned. But that story doesn't make sense. Why are you bringing this up now? More importantly, why is my brother here? You lied to me. My daughter would never climb Ayers Rock. I glared at Harry, who still couldn't get up from the floor. My daughter hates heights. Ever since she slipped and fell off a cliff during a mountain climb long ago, suffering a major injury, Taylor was a girl who hesitated even to step out onto the balcony of our second-floor home. She was so terrified of falling from high places. There's no way such a Taylor would willingly climb an unstable rock mountain. Taylor listened to my selfish request. I begged her, saying that climbing would soon be prohibited, and I really wanted to go before that happened. She agreed, but because of that, Harry's voice trailed off. His face seemed to suggest he felt responsible, but I wasn't about to be fooled by such an act. Even if that were true, a normal husband would have stopped her from diving if she had sprained her ankle. Besides, Taylor had diving as a hobby, so she would have understood the dangers of diving when in poor condition. She wasn't foolish enough to take such a risk just because she was looking forward to it. Besides, I don't trust you anymore. You, whose background I don't even know. No, that's... As Harry mumbled, still sprawled on the floor, Anthony grabbed him by the neck and forced him into a formal sitting position. Probably due to the earlier punch to the face, Harry was shaking and crying. Anthony is a tall, strong man. He's apparently a martial arts instructor, so it's no wonder Harry would want to cry if such a person angrily punched him, but I felt no sympathy for Harry. You still haven't learned your lesson, and you're still doing this kind of thing. Since when did you start going by the name Harry? Your name is Daniel, isn't it? Oh, so that's your real name? Who exactly are you? Why did you use a false name to deceive me and my daughter? Explain it yourself. Daniel, formerly known as Harry, averted his eyes from me and refused to answer. Everything about his identity had been a lie. His occupation, his claim of having no relatives. It was all made up. In reality, his parents are still alive, and he even has 2 older brothers. If you won't say it, shall I? I already know everything you've been doing. You've been repeating marriage fraud all over the country, haven't you? I heard you were even in prison once. According to Anthony, after Daniel had finished his prison term and was released, he had been living quietly at home for a while under the watchful eye of his parents and siblings. However, one day, when the family members took their eyes off him for a moment, he suddenly disappeared. You really never know. To think such a terrible person was living so close by without me noticing anything. But thanks to my niece, we were able to find out. It was my niece's testimony that she thought she saw this person in a photo her senior showed her that led to the discovery of his true identity. My niece had gone to a university away from her hometown and found a job in that area after graduation. Your brother was a senior member of the club I was in. I thought I'd seen you somewhere before, and it was in a family photo that my senior had shown me once. When Harry heard this, he was speechless, with his eyes wide open. He must never have imagined that my relative and his relative would be connected in such a place. I thought it might be a coincidence because the names were completely different, but I never imagined he'd be such a dangerous person. I truly don't know how to apologize enough. Anthony bowed his head to us, seemingly apologetic from the bottom of his heart. This guy has been cheating people out of money and putting them down since he was a kid. I thought he might have reflected a bit after going to prison, but to think he would do such a thing to someone's daughter. Wait, Taylor's death was an accident. I didn't do anything. Harry suddenly interjected, seemingly panicked. What? You're speaking as if my daughter was killed by someone. When I pointed this out, he made an expression that seemed to say, oh no. Perhaps the shock of being hit made it easier for him to slip up. Of course, I had it properly investigated. My niece and I had spoken with the local police and tour guides there. We uncovered the truth about what happened to my daughter. My daughter had not injured her foot at all, and the cause of her drowning was an equipment malfunction that led to an air leak in the tank. Apparently, after the instructor's inspection, the valve had loosened for some reason, causing air to leak out and resulting in oxygen deprivation. The facility cameras clearly captured the moment you touched my daughter's tank just before she dived. Cameras? I never heard anything about cameras, and with special reagents, fingerprints can be collected even after being submerged in seawater. When I emphasized that we had secured the evidence, Harry started crying again. I had trouble with a woman at work and lost trust in women. He suddenly started talking about himself. Did he think this would change how I see him? But I didn't intend to harm Taylor. I just thought about getting some compensation or sickness benefits if she got a little injured. So you were trying to skim off some money. You really are scum from birth, Anthony sighed and added. And stop that disgusting fake crying. Besides, you're the one who caused the trouble, aren't you? You took a high-handed attitude towards female employees, forced them to quit, and that became a problem, leading to you being kicked out. I had already heard from Anthony that Harry had caused problems at his company in the past and been fired. He had been living off money he had scammed from people. You've always been like that, a liar, sneaky, never living an honest life. Shut up with your nagging. What's with you people? You've been ganging up on me this whole time. Perhaps recognizing that he was surrounded by enemies, Harry stopped crying and started to lose his temper. I'm different from my dad and brothers who are such boring people. I'm a chosen one. Working hard and getting all sweaty doesn't suit me. His absurd claims made me, Anthony, and my niece all take a step back. What's wrong with wanting to make money easily? Not wanting to hear any more of his outrageous logic, I glared at him angrily. I'm still her husband. No divorce. No end to the marital relationship. The insurance money and survivor's pension are all mine. It's your daughter's fault for being deceived. With an evil grin, he truly looked like a villain. Insurance money, huh? I've already taken care of all that. Taylor didn't change any of her life insurance details from before the marriage. Also, since you don't have any children, you're not eligible for the survivor's pension. When I calmly informed him of this, he was at a loss for words again. Oh, didn't I mention I work for an insurance company? Taylor came to consult with me about reviewing her insurance before going on the trip. After going through the process of changing the insurance beneficiary and reviewing the coverage, I told them I would take care of the rest and sent the two off on their trip. Then, just as I was about to process everything, I received a call from the local police, and it was still untouched. Were you in such a hurry for money? But if you were after the insurance money, shouldn't you have checked who the beneficiary was before taking action? I didn't want to know what was going through the mind of the person who took my daughter's life, but even from an outsider's perspective, it seemed like an incredibly shallow and sloppy approach. The insurance money has been properly deposited into my account. Damn it. It's your fault for not processing it quickly. Give me the money. It's mine. As Harry lunged at me, saying this, Anthony restrained him. However, at this moment, my heart reached its limit. My body moved on its own, and I grabbed a bag containing my bank book, credit cards, and other items, then forcefully slammed it into Harry's face. Ouch! Of course, it hurts when another impact is added to an already beaten face, but my daughter's pain and suffering were nothing like this. If you want it so badly, I'll give it to you. I said this with surprising calmness. I couldn't confirm it myself, but I think my expression must have been like a no mask. I don't need the insurance money or anything else, so give it back. I slowly approached Harry, speaking each word deliberately. Give me back my daughter. I could hear Harry quietly swallowing hard. I've recorded all your confessions, and I've called the police. You're going back behind bars, you damn it. This pisses me off. Remember this. I won't let this slide. When I get out, I'll do it again. I'll send you to the same place as your daughter. Anthony firmly held on to Harry, who was screaming and yelling. That's scary, but you should remember this too. It seems like this is the first time you've taken someone's life, but this time it'll be national news. Your actions will become known to all your past victims and their families. Outside the house, I could already see the flashing lights of police cars. I will never forget you. I'll always remember, and all the people you've deceived, driven to despair, and made suffer are all glaring at you. Huh? What's that supposed to mean? For me, it's enough if you receive legal punishment, but even if that's enough for me, what about others? Do you have any idea how many people hold grudges against you? Even after saying this much, it didn't seem to sink in for him. Not everyone seeks revenge through proper methods, you know? Whatever punishment anyone gives you, you'd better accept it without complaint. My niece showed the arriving police officers into the house. Your name, face, crimes, and punishment will all be made public. I wonder who will be waiting for you on the day of your release and what they'll have prepared. I could see the blood drain from Harry's face as he looked at me. It seems he finally understood what I was saying. Perhaps he was counting his sins. Anthony held on to Harry's arm until the very end, and Harry showed no signs of trying to escape, allowing himself to be dragged away by the police. Maybe he had lost the will to resist due to fear of what would happen to him from now on. Thus, Harry, or rather Daniel, was arrested, and his face and real name were made public in national news, bringing his misdeeds to light. With one crime piled upon another, it seems he won't be able to come out from behind bars for at least 10 years. Even if he could get out, what awaits him is a massive amount of damage claims and a lonely life. It seems his habit of trying to manipulate people with tears and lies hasn't improved even in prison, and he's spending his days without being trusted by anyone. To this day, my daughter's friends still visit my house regularly. Through these connections, I've made new friends too, and thanks to their presence, I'm inspired to live strongly for my daughter's sake as well. Story 2. My husband locked me, pregnant and suffering from heat stroke, in a 104 degrees Fahrenheit room, saying just sleep it off. 3 days later, he returned home, smelled decay, and hurriedly opened the door to a horrific scene. Heat exhaustion? Just sleep it off. My husband coldly declared to me, 9 months pregnant, as he forbade me from using the air conditioner in the scorching summer heat. I collapsed in our 105 degrees Fahrenheit room, unable to even stand up or drink water, my consciousness fading away. Then he left for a vacation. 3 days later, when my husband returned from his enjoyable trip, he found our home in a miserable state, filled with the stench of decay. But that was just the beginning of the hell he was about to experience. I married Niall, my husband, 5 years my senior, when I was 28. About a year later, I discovered I was pregnant, something we'd been hoping for. Though his mother lived nearby, we didn't interact much, but she was delighted to hear about her first grandchild. To everyone else, we seemed like the perfect couple. But even in our happy life, I had a worry. My husband was incredibly stingy. When we were dating, Niall seemed kind and understanding. I fell in love with that man and decided to marry him. But once we started living together, his personality completely changed. Casey, the electric bill is $5 higher this month, and the grocery and household expenses are up from last month too. You're being too extravagant. What? That's just a normal fluctuation, isn't it? Everything's getting more expensive lately. We can't help it. Then use your head and find ways to economize. You're a housewife, aren't you? You're useless. Every month, my husband would meticulously check our expenses, and if he felt anything was even slightly higher, he'd invariably berate me. If I wanted something, I couldn't just buy it without Niall scolding me. So I had to check with him first, and most of the time he'd dismiss it, saying I didn't need such things. I was starting to feel suffocated in this marriage, feeling like I was under constant surveillance. When I found out I was pregnant, I felt joy, but also a twinge of anxiety. Still, I thought surely he'd change once the baby was born. I used to work full-time at a large corporation, but as soon as I found out I was pregnant, I started experiencing severe morning sickness. The doctor diagnosed it as hyperemesis gravidarum and advised me to take a leave of absence until my condition improved. That night, I told my husband what the obstetrician had said. Niall frowned. What? Absolutely not. But I can't work in this condition with all the nausea. If you take leave, that means no salary, right? That's a problem. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He was more worried about the salary than my health. But my body was screaming for rest, so I had to convince Niall somehow. The morning sickness should only last another month or two, and HR said I could get sickness benefits, so we'll manage. No, it'll still be less than if you worked normally. No way. He refused to budge and shut himself in the bedroom before the conversation was even over. After much deliberation, I decided to ask my workplace for permission to work from home for the next 2 months until my condition stabilized. I struggled through work at home, fighting waves of nausea every day. My husband didn't say anything about this since my salary remained the same. It felt so unfair. There was a reason I felt this way. While my husband was extremely critical of our living expenses and my purchases, he was quite extravagant when it came to his own spending. He'd buy whatever he wanted on a whim, and his clothes were all brand-name items. My dissatisfaction with my husband, who loosened the purse strings only for himself, kept growing. But whenever I pointed this out, he'd fly into a rage, and his bad mood would last for days, so I gradually stopped saying anything. As summer arrived, I finally entered my 9th month of pregnancy. I had started my maternity leave a little earlier and was enjoying peaceful days at home preparing for the baby's arrival while doing housework. However, my husband seemed displeased with this situation. The electric bill has gone up since you've been home. While he hadn't said anything when I was working from home and receiving my full salary, my maternity leave income was about 80% of my usual pay. This seemed to irk him. Well, that can't be helped. It's hot, so we need the air conditioner this time of year. No, we managed without the AC during the day before. Don't use it until I get home. What? That's impossible in the middle of summer. I naturally objected, but he wouldn't budge. From that day on, I had to endure the summer heat without air conditioning. I considered secretly using the AC when my husband wasn't home, but he'd check the electric bill at the end of the month and find out. So that wasn't an option. My body temperature was already higher than usual due to being 9 months pregnant. After about a week, I collapsed with symptoms of heat exhaustion, nausea, and dizziness. When my husband came home, I explained the situation. Just sleep it off. That's impossible in this hot room. I'm worried about the baby too. Can you take me to the hospital tomorrow? I'm going on a 3-day company trip from tomorrow, so no. I was shocked by my husband's casual words. I hadn't heard anything about a trip, and with my due date so close, he was going to be away for 3 days. Ignoring my shock, Niall cheerfully packed his bags. The next day, before leaving, he warned me, "Don't turn on the AC until I get back. The electric bill is too high, and don't you dare go to the hospital. It'll get better on its own." To prevent me from going to the hospital, he took my smartphone and placed it out of my reach before leaving. After Niall left, my condition only worsened. Eventually, I couldn't even get up or drink water. This isn't just dangerous for me, but for the baby too. I lay there helpless and despairing in a room that had reached 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Suddenly, I noticed the intercom was ringing. It seemed I had lost consciousness, and it was already dark outside. I was too weak to get up and answer the door, but the intercom kept ringing persistently. Who could it be? As I pondered hazily, I heard a familiar voice calling my name from outside the door. With a start, I gathered my last ounces of strength and crawled to the entrance, using that voice as my guide. Just as I managed to unlock the door, I completely lost consciousness. 3 days later, my husband returned home. As soon as he opened the living room door, he covered his mouth and nose. He was retching at the terrible smell. What's this smell of decay and all these flies? Oh no! Niall frantically searched the room, seemingly looking for something. He returned to the living room and stared intently at the sofa and blanket I usually use when lying down. He seemed afraid to touch it. Then, as if struck by an idea, he started making a phone call. A ringtone sounded from high up in the living room. It was probably my phone he was calling, but the phone he had taken from me before leaving was still there. My husband looked around, found my smartphone, and picked it up. So it must be. Once again, he tried to reach for the blanket on the sofa. I'm not there. Oh. Niall was so startled by my voice coming from somewhere that he lost his balance and fell onto the sofa. Then he started apologizing. I'm sorry. Did you think I was decomposing under that blanket? He looked around, then suddenly yanked off the blanket. There were just some cushions piled up underneath. Hey, where are you? My husband's voice was angry now, demanding to know where my voice was coming from. At this point, I wasn't actually in the house. I was watching what was happening inside through a baby monitor camera my colleagues had given me before my maternity leave began. I'm here. Here. Can you hear my voice coming from that small thing next to the TV? Huh? Where are you talking from? He asked irritably. When I told him where I was, Niall rushed out of the living room. Within 30 minutes, my husband arrived where I was. Why did you go to the hospital without my permission? You disobeyed me, he shouted as soon as he saw me. I was lying in bed with an 4 drip, but my husband didn't even offer a word of comfort at the sight. Yes, this was a hospital room, a room with proper air conditioning. I'll explain later how I ended up here, but my husband started saying things like this. This is a private room, isn't it? Do you have any idea how much this costs? I didn't answer, just stared at Niall. And what's with the smell in that room? It stinks, and there are flies everywhere. We can't live there like that. Do you know how much house cleaning will cost? As my husband went on and on about money, I let out a heavy sig. Was it really that bad? That was the leftover food you didn't clean up 3 days ago. Scrambled eggs, blueberry yogurt. What else was it? Of course, it would rot if left in a room without air conditioning. You see, on that day I was too sick to clean up Niall's leftovers, and then I was hospitalized, so everything was left on the table. Weren't you worried about me and the baby, telling us to sleep in a room hot enough to rot food? If you had cleaned up properly, there wouldn't have been a problem. You're always exaggerating things. First with morning sickness, now with the pregnancy. My husband sneered at me, saying outrageous things. I could have been the one rotting there. It was that dangerous. I was utterly disappointed in Niall, but he showed no sign of remorse. Even if you don't care about me, I can't imagine raising a child with someone who doesn't worry about their baby. What are you talking about? Are you planning to become a single mother? You can't raise a child alone. Besides, being a single parent means living in poverty. Don't you think that's pitiful for the child? Niall said with a smirk, looking down on me. How far is this man going to belittle me? Suppressing the urge to slap him, my heart was burning with a desire for revenge. Suddenly, the door to the hospital room opened, and someone walked in. My husband was surprised to see this person, his eyes widening. Mom? Why are you here? I called her. Is that a problem? Besides, she's the one who saved my life. You see, it was my mother-in-law who had rescued me from the house and got me admitted to this hospital that day. But I thought you didn't like Mom, huh? You're the one who's been uncomfortable with your mother and avoiding her all this time, right? I've been exchanging contact information with her and keeping in touch occasionally. I never heard about that. Did I need to tell you? It seems Niall found his strict and nagging mother bothersome, but that was just her motherly love. However, unable to see that, my husband had unilaterally distanced himself from her. As for me, ever since I reported my pregnancy, I had made it a daily routine to reply to the morning emails from my mother-in-law checking on my condition. Of course, I found it difficult to consult her about my troubles with Niall's excessive frugality, but I was encouraged by her kind messages that arrived every day. On the day my husband left for his trip and took away my smartphone, I couldn't reply to my mother-in-law's email. The sudden break in our daily habit must have worried her. Concerned, she came to check on me just in case, and that's how I was discovered and rescued. It was her who had been persistently ringing the doorbell and calling out to me in my fading consciousness. Casey was in a life-threatening situation if she had stayed at home. That's an exaggeration. You almost lost your wife and child, and you're still saying such nonsense. My mother-in-law, who had heard everything from the hallway, scolded Niall. My husband backed away, intimidated by his mother's intensity. Don't interfere in our marriage. Even so, my husband retorted while trying to forcibly grab my arm and get me out of the bed, intending to discharge me and leave this place quickly. I shook off his hand. I'm divorcing you. As a father's responsibility, you'll pay child support properly. Well, I might agree to a divorce, but I won't pay any money. My husband shouted, his face red with anger, spittle flying. From there, neither of us would back down, and the conversation reached an impasse. That's when my mother-in-law pulled out a piece of paper. It's not that you won't pay, it's that you can't pay, right? What? My mother-in-law thrust at my husband was a debt collection notice. How did you get that? Seeing it, my husband was visibly shaken, cold sweat breaking out on his face. Actually, my mother-in-law had found that letter in the mailbox when she rescued me. I was shocked to see this. So that's why you were so keen on saving money and wouldn't let me take time off work. You were planning to use my income to repay your debts. How I use the family's money is my business. It seemed she had hit the nail on the head. He stumbled over his words for a moment, but then spat them out as if in defiance. Just then, there was a knock on the door, and a nurse came in to announce it was feeding time. My husband tilted his head in confusion. When I was brought to the hospital, I was in a critical condition. Judging that both mother and child wouldn't survive otherwise, they had performed an emergency C-section. It was all thanks to my mother-in-law finding me at that crucial moment and calling an ambulance. I had been covering my stomach with a blanket on the bed since Niall arrived, so he hadn't noticed that I had given birth. Pay off your own debts with your own efforts. Because of your selfishness, we were put in mortal danger. You don't deserve to be a father. Sensing my firm resolve for divorce from my expression, my husband suddenly became flustered. I was wrong. I'll apologize. So let's reconsider the divorce. It's too late. I've been patient for so long, but this incident has completely drained my love for you. Please don't abandon me. Now in tears, he turned to his mother for help. I'm on Casey's side. I don't care about you anymore. No, Mom. Casey, please don't abandon me. A father like you is worse than no father at all. I'll raise the child on my own. When I firmly rejected and pushed away my husband, he was dragged out of the hospital room by his mother. After that, Niall reluctantly signed the divorce papers. I hired a lawyer and made sure to establish a proper agreement for child support payments, securing a promise of $700 per month until the child turns 18. Without my income that he had been counting on, my ex-husband quickly ran into trouble repaying his debts and was evicted from our apartment. Now it seems he's sleeping in the park and working day and night, trapped in a cycle of debt. As for me, I'm managing quite well with my own income and the child support, enjoying a life with more freedom and less stress than before. My mother-in-law still visits every 2 weeks as the child's grandmother, maintaining our relationship. I hope to continue watching my child grow alongside her. Story 3. Knocked out at my mother-in-law's funeral, I woke up in a dark coffin. Cremation flames closing in. I screamed desperately. Then, the unthinkable happened. Where am I? It's pitch black, and I can't see anything. I, who had been knocked unconscious during my mother-in-law's funeral, awoke to find myself trapped in a cramped, box-like space. I desperately tried to push and bang on the lid to open it. Then I heard a man's voice approaching, saying, "Now it's time for the cremation," and the box I was in started to rattle. Could it be? Am I inside a coffin? It seemed they were about to cremate me, and I was utterly terrified. Was I about to be sent to the afterlife like this? I'm Jasmine. I married Brandon, who was 2 years older than me and worked at the city hall when I was 24. Although we didn't live with his parents, his mother lived nearby. Jasmine, if you ever need anything, just let me know. My mother-in-law was always kind and easy to talk to. For me, who had lost my parents at a young age, she was like a real mother. At first, my husband and I lived happily together, but from the second year, conflicts increased due to his wasteful spending. You want living expenses? You're working full-time too, so you must have money, right? I've been paying for rent, utilities, and food all by myself since last year. I want you to share the burden properly. It's always money, money, money with you. Do you think I'm an ATM or something? Whenever I tried to discuss finances, Brandon would always deflect the conversation and shut himself in his room, so we couldn't have a proper discussion. Although Brandon had a stable income as a civil servant, he didn't contribute money to the household and often went out late at night. He would come home drunk in the middle of the night, emptying his wallet after treating his colleagues. This was no way to live. At wit's end, I decided to work not only at my daytime job selling insurance, but also at a pub at night. I reported this to my mother-in-law as well. You shouldn't push yourself so hard. I'll talk to Brandon about it. When she found out I had started working nights too, my usually quiet mother-in-law became furious. I've tried talking to him many times, but but he won't listen. I see. I'm so sorry about my foolish son. If only my husband were still alive at a time like this. Maybe it's because I raised him poorly. Actually, my father-in-law had already passed away before I married Brandon. My distraught mother-in-law tried to offer financial assistance, but I couldn't burden her, who was living alone. I'll try to have a proper talk with Brandon again. Then at least let me drive you to and from the pub. I can't let you bear all the hardship. With my mother-in-law's help, I managed to earn enough to cover our living expenses. She was a good driver, and our conversations during the rides were lively and comforting. It seemed that my mother-in-law had been frequently warning Brandon about money matters, but his wasteful spending didn't stop. Hey, tomorrow's mom's funeral, so get ready. What? What do you mean? One morning, just before leaving for work, Brandon casually informed me that his mother had passed away. Shocked, I pressed him for details, but Brandon just glared at me irritably. Shut up. Mom died in a car accident. Are you enjoying wasting my time before work? Can't you at least say, have a good day or something? He snapped at me and left in a bad mood. This can't be happening to your mother. What exactly happened? I knew she was an excellent driver from when she drove me to and from the pub. No matter how many times I asked Brandon about the accident, he wouldn't tell me anything. I was overwhelmed by a profound sadness and despair, as if the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. I have a friend at the funeral home we're using, so make arrangements with him. I'm too busy with work. My husband left the house, dumping all the preparations on me, who was at a loss for words, with an annoyed look on his face. After that, I couldn't get in touch with him, and I spent my time preparing to bid farewell to my mother-in-law. The next day, Brandon showed up at the funeral home with a grin on his face. I noticed him and rushed over, but he wouldn't even make eye contact with me. Where have you been? Your phone was off, and you stayed somewhere last night, didn't you? Not really. My husband refused to answer my questions. During the funeral, Brandon occasionally chatted with the attendees, but mostly just yawned. He even fell asleep at times. Don't you feel sad that such a kind mother-in-law is gone? I could only feel disappointed in my husband's behavior. At one point, he suddenly looked my way. Go get the spare cigarettes and lighter from the car. I couldn't leave the chief mourner, Brandon, alone at the venue. Following his instructions, which came with an unusually harsh glare, I headed to the parking lot. I can't find them. I searched around the driver's seat but couldn't find anything, so I started looking in the back seat. Suddenly, the sunlight was blocked by something behind me, and my surroundings darkened. Is someone behind me? Just as I was about to turn around, I felt a dull sound and intense pain in my head, and everything went black. I lost consciousness before I could even understand what had happened. I don't know how much time had passed. I was awakened by a throbbing, intense headache. It was a place as dark as if my eyes were still closed. Where am I? When I tried to get up, I realized I seemed to be trapped in a narrow, box-like space and couldn't move. I pushed and banged on the wall in front of me, trying to get out somehow. Then I heard a man's voice approaching, saying, "Now it's time for the cremation," and the box I was in started to rattle. Could it be? Am I inside a coffin? At that moment, I realized I was about to be burned alive and was utterly terrified. Let me out. I'm alive. Help. I banged on the coffin with all my might and shouted desperately. Then I heard the surprised voices of the staff, saying, "Hey, there's a sound coming from inside." The lid of the coffin was opened, and I was rescued. Although I had narrowly escaped cremation, I was trembling and pale, and the staff, perhaps out of sympathy, explained the situation to me. Apparently, my husband had requested that I be sent along with his beloved mother, and I had been rushed in for an urgent funeral. And what surprised me most was that I was supposed to have passed away after falling down the stairs. But I was hit when I was looking for cigarettes and a lighter in the car, wasn't I? How could this be? Considering that this happened in the small parking lot of the funeral home, I thought it must have been someone attending the funeral or a staff member who was suspicious. I asked the crematorium staff not to tell anyone that I had come back to life and to pretend to my husband that the cremation had been completed. Apparently, Brandon hadn't even attended his mother's cremation and had said he was going on a 3-day trip and asked for the ashes to be mailed to him. Is that even possible? I was a bit suspicious of his behavior, but to uncover the truth, it would be easier to pretend that the cremation had been completed, using Brandon's words. Then a staff member revealed a shocking fact to me. What? That's terrible. I was furious at the horrendous incident. I decided in my heart to take revenge on a certain person. However, I still needed more preparation. I needed evidence to hand over to the police, the person who had done such a terrible thing. While staying at a hotel, I went to various places, including law offices, and then at my mother-in-law's house. I discovered something astonishing that she had left behind. With this much evidence gathered, all that was left was to corner that person. For days after being discovered at the crematorium, I decided to return home. When I entered the living room, there was my husband lying on the sofa. A Boston bag was thrown carelessly beside him. He must have just returned from his trip and taken time off work to rest. "Jasmine, why are you alive?" He saw me and shouted in surprise, nearly falling over. "I heard you were flirting with your mistress during the funeral home meeting." I came back from the afterlife because I was so angry. I glared at him, my eyes blazing with anger, and shouted even louder than Brandon's cry of surprise. Actually, the shocking fact I had heard from the staff when I woke up at the crematorium was about my husband's affair. Apparently, he had brought his mistress along, grinning and introducing her to the staff, saying, "This is my girlfriend. We're about to go on a trip." I've never seen or heard of anyone bringing their mistress along when they're about to cremate their wife. You're the lowest of the low. I took out photos of evidence of the affair from my handbag and scattered them on the living room table. There were pictures of Brandon flirting with a woman and credit card statements. He stared wide-eyed at the mountain of documents. Actually, I had been investigating the 3-day trip Brandon had mentioned. I found out where they were staying from the first day's card transaction history and rushed there immediately. What I saw was my husband arm in arm with a young woman, looking lovey-dovey on a date. They dined at expensive restaurants, and he bought her luxury brand bags and accessories. You were having an affair even while I was working day and night, and even when I was put in a coffin, you monster. No, it was a business entertainment. I was asked to accompany the daughter of a client. It was tough, you know. Brandon tried to play it off, sweating nervously and averting his eyes. "Oh, is that so? I'm sorry for misunderstanding. Of course, you're stupid, but try to act smart. That's why you throw these ridiculous hysterics." When I pretended to be fooled and apologized, he suddenly became arrogant. This is how my husband always denied my personality, robbed me of my confidence and hope, and did whatever he wanted after squeezing money out of me. But this time, I won't lose. I had decided to fight to the end for my mother-in-law's sake too. But I have even more evidence. Don't you want to hear your beloved mistress's voice? I smiled mischievously and showed him a voice recorder I took out of my bag. My husband looked at my hands and squinted suspiciously. I pressed the play button on the recorder and played the recorded audio. It was the mistress confessing her relationship with my husband. Actually, just before returning home that day, I had ambushed the mistress at her home. She was so surprised to see me, who was supposed to be dead and cremated, that she let out a scream. She must have thought I had come back as a ghost. "If you confess honestly, I'll forgive you with just compensation." When I threatened her, the woman trembled and cried out, "I'm sorry." With big tears, she spilled everything about what had happened so far, and I recorded her story. And there, it was revealed that the mistress was a staff member at the city hall where Brandon worked. She said she was persistently courted by my husband, and despite knowing he was married, ended up dating him due to his lavish gift attacks. Their relationship had started around the 2nd year of our marriage, just when his wasteful spending began. The mistress cried and clung to me, saying, I couldn't refuse because he was so persistent. He gave me expensive brand gifts, so I thought it was just a bit of fun. The voice echoing in the living room said, "It's not serious at all. I mean, come on, who would fall in love with an old man like that?" "No way," Brandon muttered and looked at me with an indescribable expression. "So you were having an affair, but your partner didn't love you? Too bad, after all that money you spent on her." I couldn't help but burst out laughing at my husband's pitiful state. "Don't laugh. I gave her so many presents. She said she loved me." He stomped his feet, nearly in tears, but the recording continued to play, detailing his wasteful spending, and ended with the woman's scream. "It was just for the money. That's really all it was. You foolishly existed and got into debt of $60,000 because of money troubles. You good for nothing." I thrust the loan document I had taken out of my bag in front of Brandon's face. I had found that paper when I searched his study during his trip. Furthermore, when I checked the credit card usage history on Brandon's computer, I found evidence of his extravagance over the past 2 years. The reason I couldn't get in touch with my husband from the day before to the day of his mother's funeral was that he had dumped the funeral preparations on me and gone on a trip with his mistress. Your mother must be crying in the afterlife. How much more unfilial can you be? It's not like I had to prepare for the ceremony or anything. You're exaggerating. As a wife, you should have been happy to take care of it. My husband started to abuse me, raising his voice as I accused him. Your lack of filial piety isn't just that. I know you did something even worse. When I glared at my husband with a demonic expression and shouted at him, he shuddered. You aimed for the inheritance to repay your debts. That's why you tampered with your mother's car to cause an accident, right? When I confronted him with the truth, Brandon turned pale and hung his head. Actually, while searching for the person who had hit me, I was able to hear details about the traffic accident that caused my mother-in-law's death from the funeral home staff. Apparently, my mother-in-law, who was a skilled driver, had mistaken the brake for the accelerator as she was trying to park her car near a store close to her home. She broke through the parking lot fence and fell into the river flowing beyond it, never to return. Because a similar major accident due to pedal confusion had occurred in the same place a year ago, the police had concluded it was another case of mistaking the brake for the accelerator. Feeling that this was unlike my mother-in-law, I had been investigating the accident as well. I placed the results of the investigation of my mother-in-law's accident vehicle, which I had requested from a traffic accident investigation company, on the table while my husband watched with bated breath. Her accident vehicle had already been scrapped, but fortunately, it was still remaining at the scrap yard without being completely dismantled. I had secured the car and, using connections from the insurance company where I worked, had it thoroughly examined by a specialist company. The results showed that the brakes had been unnaturally tampered with to stop working. The car was in a state where it could have had an accident at any time. It could just be deterioration, couldn't it? Brandon, sweating profusely and with lips as white as his pale face, retorted. The investigation company preserved fingerprints that shouldn't have been there during normal driving. I showed my husband the photo attached to the documents. Judging from the size, they must be his. Upon seeing the fingerprints, my husband covered his face with his hands and fell silent. And then you targeted me next, I told Brandon in a quiet voice. Why would I target you? If it was for the inheritance, Mom alone would have been enough. My husband hurriedly denied it, spitting saliva as he spoke, but his voice was trembling and seemed about to fade away. I found these in your mother's drawer while you were enjoying your affair trip. I took out my mother-in-law's will and diary from my bag. These were the surprising things my mother-in-law had left behind. The diary was written in my mother-in-law's handwriting. Do not let my son with a wasteful habit inherit the estate. My inheritance goes to my hard-working daughter-in-law. And to ensure it would definitely be inherited, the name and contact information of the lawyer she had appointed as the executor of her will were also written. As soon as I saw this, it clicked. It was the same name as the middle-aged man Brandon had been eagerly talking to at his mother's funeral. Thinking he must be the lawyer, I immediately headed to his office. When I asked about my mother-in-law's will, he told me that Brandon had urged him to hurry the inheritance process at the funeral. The lawyer told you that according to the will, the inheritance goes to your wife, didn't he? And he said I was asked to inform you after the funeral was over, so I was planning to tell you after this. When my husband heard this, he looked as if he was about to scream. When you found out you couldn't inherit the property you were counting on to repay your debts, you panicked and lured me into the car, hitting me from behind. Isn't that right? Even if you got rid of your mother, you couldn't get the inheritance, so you intended to silence me, who would inherit, to make sure it would be yours this time. When I stared straight at my husband and declared this, he hung his head. You can't say for sure that I did it. I've even secured the weapon. What? I wiped the blood off the ashtray and put it back in its place. Oh my, how do you know? The weapon was an ashtray? When I sharply questioned him, Brandon began to panic. Actually, during my husband's trip, I had investigated our home, the car where I had been hit, as well as the funeral home and parking lot. The inside of the car, which was usually messy, was unusually clean. There were no traces of blood, probably because he had had it cleaned. I couldn't find anything that looked like a weapon, but I didn't give up and collected the car's floor mats. I looked around the funeral home too, but couldn't find any clues. Exhausted, I sat down on the curb in the parking lot. When I looked down in despair, I noticed glass fragments glittering in the grooves of the drain cover. Looking closer, the glass fragments had small red stains, and nearby there were small brown, leaf-like fragments. I realized these might be tobacco leaves, and the fragments might be from an ashtray. I remembered that on the day of my mother-in-law's funeral, my husband had made a fuss, asking, "Where can I smoke?" And staff had guided him to the smoking area on the rooftop terrace. When I went there, I indeed found glass ashtrays, and upon closer inspection, one of them had a chipped bottom. He might have tried to throw away the weapon once, smashing it on the ground, and that's when the bloodstained part chipped off a little. After explaining the situation, I borrowed that ashtray and, through my lawyer, had the evidence examined. It tested positive for my blood and my husband's fingerprints. "It was you who hit me." My husband, with everything exposed, came crawling to me, scratching his head. "I'm sorry. You're the only one I love. I was jealous that my friend had a mistress, so I imitated him. Look, that guy at the funeral home, he's an old friend of mine." As he was making all sorts of excuses, a call came in from the lawyer. After hearing the content of the call, I glared at my husband. "You forged documents and conspired with that friend to try to burn me alive, didn't you?" The lawyer had been checking how the city office was handling my supposed death. According to him, I wasn't recorded as deceased, but instead, a missing person report had been filed. Normally, a cremation permit is issued, and you take a death certificate written by a doctor to the city office. However, Brandon, wanting to cremate quickly without going through a hospital, had abused his position as a city hall employee to create documents on his own. This forceful method had worked because the person in charge of arranging the cremation was my husband's friend. However, that person had been off sick since the day of my scheduled cremation. So while I was talking with my husband, the lawyer had gone to this person's house to talk and immediately called to report the content. Brandon's friend had become emaciated with guilt for helping to burn someone alive. He confessed that he had been threatened by my husband. "I'll give you part of the inheritance as a reward. If you don't help, I'll expose your affair." And so he had helped arrange the cremation. When he was told I was alive, he cried with relief. The lawyer ended the call, saying, "I'm heading there with the police. We'll arrive soon. You're the lowest, making even your friend help with your evil deeds, trying to kill your mother and wife. Go to hell." When I shouted loudly, Brandon could no longer even come up with excuses and crouched down weakly on the spot. $50,000 in compensation. I'll also demand $10,000 in compensation from your mistress. Of course, I won't give you any of your mother's inheritance. Pay back the $60,000 debt yourself. Hearing my final words, my husband stared at me with wide eyes. "No way. It's impossible to pay such a large sum. Please forgive me. We're close, aren't we?" With tears streaming down his face, Brandon inched closer to me, trying to grab my hand. However, I pushed him away with all my might. "Don't think you can get away with consuming people with greed. Suffer for the rest of your life." When I spat these words at him, Brandon burst into tears, snot running down his face. After a while, the lawyer arrived with the police. Watching my husband being dragged away, I felt my heart lighten a little. Looking at the blue sky outside, I felt that my mother-in-law must be happy that I had solved the case. Afterwards, I immediately divorced Brandon. With his arrest, his affair was exposed at his workplace, and both he and his mistress were fired. Brandon is now facing trial. According to the lawyer, he might be behind bars for many years. Even if he gets out, he'll have to pay $50,000 in compensation and $60,000 in debt. He'll spend the rest of his life struggling with debt. On the other hand, I've fully recovered and regained stability in my life. I can now focus on work, and my insurance sales performance is good. Recently, I was headhunted by a foreign company. Moreover, an ex-boyfriend I reunited with at a class reunion offered to help with my career change, and things are going well in that area too. I think all this good fortune might be thanks to my mother-in-law watching over me from heaven. I'm considering donating my mother-in-law's inheritance without touching it, but that should be okay, right? Story 4. My mother-in-law pushed me while I was pregnant, causing me to lose my baby. 3 years later, the family is celebrating my sister-in-law's pregnancy. My husband asks, "You've forgiven us, right?" With an icy smile, I plan my revenge. "It was an accident. There's nothing we can do about it." My husband wouldn't accept my plea after I miscarried due to being tripped by my mother-in-law, who was living with us. Even though I could no longer bear children, I hope it's born healthy. 3 years later, my mother-in-law joyfully celebrated my sister-in-law's pregnancy. Treated like a servant every day, my spirit was completely worn down. At the time, however, after this, an unexpected turn of events reversed all circumstances, greatly changing my life. My name is Kristen. I married Scott, who was 3 years older than me, when I was 25. We had attended the same university, and I fell in love with him at first sight. After pursuing him relentlessly, he finally noticed me, proposed, and we got married. I was on cloud nine, looking forward to a life with my beloved Scott, who was handsome and kind. But little did I know then that this would be the beginning of difficult days. The first challenge came right after we tied the knot about our new home. It's okay if we live with Mom, right? Dad's passed away, so she'd be alone otherwise. I was taken aback by Scott's sudden proposal. Before marriage, I had been living alone, but he had been living at home. I had assumed we would look for a new house to live in together. Huh? Aren't we going to live by ourselves? Actually, Mom told me that if we were to get married, living together was a prerequisite. I never heard about this. I blurted out in shock at my husband's sudden confession. Apparently, he had already made an agreement with his mother to live together without my knowledge. This alone was hard to accept, but there was another problem. It seemed that my mother-in-law didn't like me very much. During our first meeting and at the wedding, she only spoke to me when absolutely necessary and occasionally gave me cold looks. I wasn't confident I could get along with a mother-in-law in such a state. However, my husband didn't seem to understand my concerns at all. What's the problem with living together? Don't worry, you'll get along well with Mom. When my beloved said this with a big smile, I couldn't respond, and so I ended up living in Scott's family home, pushed by his optimistic attitude. But as I had feared, my concerns came true. Sigh, your cooking isn't very good, is it? To spend so much time making such tasteless food. But it took so long because you forced me to clean in the middle of cooking. Are you talking back? Just because you're young and my son likes you. Don't get cocky, you incompetent girl. It seemed my mother-in-law was jealous of me, her son's wife. She couldn't stand to see me happy, so she made me quit my job, saying a woman should stay at home after marriage, and pushed all the housework onto me, harassing me when my husband wasn't around. She would spill flour right after I had cleaned or throw away the food I had made. Even when I talked to Scott about it all, he would say I'll talk to her. But despite pushing for us to live together, he didn't do anything. So even though we were newlyweds, I was already stressed out. But in the midst of all this, there was one person who was on my side. I can't believe it. You're leaving everything to Kristen? Mom, you can move too. You need to share the work. It was my sister-in-law, Vanessa, who scolded my mother-in-law for lounging on the sofa while I was doing housework. It's fine, Kristen wants to do it. That can't be true. Scott, you need to properly scold Mom too. Why am I getting scolded too? Vanessa, who was mature for her 22 years, not only scolded Scott, who was watching TV, but also helped me with the housework. Let's do it together, she said with a cheerful smile, and I felt my heart being healed. Vanessa had been friendly with me since I started dating her brother, but there was a reason why she had become so attached to me, related to an incident a few years ago. That day, Vanessa was heading to her final interview at her first choice company during her job hunt, but the train was delayed. When I happened to see her looking lost at the station, I drove her to the venue. After that, she successfully got the job offer and started working at that company, and she became even more fond of me. I'll always be on your side. Vanessa's carefree smile was one of the reasons I could endure these lonely days. However, a few months later, a big incident occurred that even her support couldn't help. Honey, I'm pregnant. One day, feeling something off about my body, I went to the hospital and called Scott with the exciting news. Having children had always been my dream. That's great. So I'm going to be a dad. Hearing Scott's happy voice on the phone, my heart was filled with joy like never before. Despite my worries, I still loved my husband at that time. Just thinking about raising a child together with him made my heart flutter. Surely now Scott will pay more attention to our family. However, even at this point, my mother-in-law seemed to resent my happiness. I wasn't expecting much, but when I told her about the pregnancy, she just nodded indifferently. There was no consideration for my condition. Rather, she started making me go shopping at distant stores and carry heavy furniture, increasingly burdening me. Then, on a day when my belly had grown quite big, it happened. Geez, you're so slow. You're in the way. My mother-in-law, more irritated than usual, suddenly pushed me from behind. As a result, I lost my balance and hit my stomach hard on the corner of a table. Ouch! At that moment, I was struck by a pain I had never experienced before. With a bad feeling, I called an ambulance myself and headed to the hospital, leaving my mother-in-law, who had fled to her room. The test results were horrific, something I wanted to turn away from. Not only had I miscarried due to the impact, but I had also become unable to have children. Because of you, I can never meet my baby again. How are you going to take responsibility for this? When I returned home, I confronted my mother-in-law, crying in shock. If only she hadn't done such a thing, I might have been able to meet my child in good health. It's your fault for being so clumsy, isn't it? How cowardly of you to blame others. But my mother-in-law didn't even show a hint of apology and continued to hurl abuse at me. And what shocked me the most were my husband's words after I explained the whole situation. I understand you're sad, but it was an accident, right? There's nothing we can do about it. He didn't even try to accept my tearful plea. Even though I could no longer hope for children, why did my husband think he could dismiss it as unavoidable? Was his joy over the pregnancy a lie? Let me tell you, don't even think about something stupid like divorce. If you leave, I'll bring Vanessa back to take care of the housework. After Scott returned to his room, my mother-in-law drove the nail in as if to further crush my despair. Honestly, divorce had crossed my mind, as she said, but I couldn't let my dear sister-in-law go through these days. When Vanessa learned about the miscarriage, she naturally scolded my mother-in-law, but even her voice was no longer a comfort to me. As if she had given up, Vanessa's visits gradually decreased. I want Vanessa to be happy. With all hope taken away and despairing for the future, I just mechanically went about doing household chores as ordered by my mother-in-law. I even felt it was pointless to think about anything anymore. But after 3 years of lonely time, one day, an unexpected turn of events occurred that reversed all circumstances. Vanessa, who hadn't shown her face for a while, came to the house. Actually, I'm pregnant with my loved one's baby. I'm planning to marry him soon. That's wonderful. I hope the baby is born healthy. My mother-in-law was overjoyed at Vanessa's somewhat radiant announcement. It was unfortunate with Kristen, so you be careful. And as Scott smiled without any ill intent, I excused myself to go shopping, leaving the scene. As much as I wanted to be happy about Vanessa's pregnancy, I couldn't bear to see his reaction, which was completely different from when it was me. But that's when it happened. Kristen, when I turned around after hearing my name called, to my surprise, Vanessa had run after me. What's wrong? You need to be careful with your body. Actually, there's something I really want to tell you. And then she approached me with an unexpected story. Vanessa strongly grasped my hand as I stood bewildered after hearing everything. Now it's my turn to help you. At Vanessa's words, looking at me with straight eyes, tears that I thought had long since dried up overflowed from my eyes. A few months later, I was waiting at home with my mother-in-law and husband for Vanessa to arrive. Today was finally the day she had promised to bring her fiancé. I'm home. I've brought him. Vanessa arrived at the house with a tall, polite man, and the next moment, Scott stared at the man with wide eyes. Huh? Mr. Miller. As Scott stood up in shock, Vanessa grinned at him. Are you surprised? You probably never thought my fiancé would be the son of your company's president, did you? It turned out that the man called Mr. Miller was working at the same company as Scott to take over his father's business. In other words, he was the young master. Apparently, Mr. Miller had fallen in love at first sight with Vanessa, who was working as a receptionist at another company, and their relationship had developed from there. So Vanessa will be the president's wife in the future, as expected of my daughter. Understanding the situation, my mother-in-law expressed even more joy. Although he still seemed bewildered, Scott also had a happy smile on his face, probably thinking that having the president of a first-class company as a relative would bring them some benefit. However, betraying their expectations, I quietly stood next to Vanessa. But this will be the last time she comes to this house. My mother-in-law and Scott gaped, unable to grasp the situation. The truth is, at this point, Vanessa and I had already made a certain decision. Huh? Don't say such selfish things. You were just ignoring it. But Vanessa has always been angry about what's been happening. A few seconds later, I glared coldly at my mother-in-law, who had shouted as if coming to her senses. Then Vanessa stepped forward and began to reveal her true feelings in a low voice. I've been warning you about how you treat Kristen, but since it seems your personality won't change, I'm cutting ties with you." On that day when Vanessa stopped me, she told me about a certain plan. For these 3 years, she had been worried about me and was plotting to somehow free me from my mother-in-law. The reason Vanessa stopped coming home was that she had given up on trying to make my mother-in-law and Scott, who showed no signs of remorse, change their ways. However, she was trying to rescue me with a different strategy, and that plan was to cut ties with her family home, including me, on the occasion of her marriage. Don't tell me you're still holding a grudge about the child? Of course. What Mom did to Kristen is absolutely unforgivable. I was speechless with Scott, who was standing there dumbfounded after being admonished by Vanessa. What on earth did I fall in love with in this man before we got married? That's all made up. I didn't do anything. You're being deceived by this woman. Despite being told so much by Vanessa, my mother-in-law, refusing to admit her faults, pointed her finger at me. In response to her, I took out my smartphone, seizing the opportunity. Can you still say that after seeing this? Finally closing her mouth in shock at the video being played. My mother-in-law, it was evidence footage of harassment that I had been collecting for several months since hearing about Vanessa's plan. Thanks to her, I found courage. I'm submitting this to a lawyer and divorcing Scott. Vanessa gave me an unchanged smile as I strongly declared this. For a long time, I had given up on my own future, feeling hopeless and that nothing could be done. However, thanks to her reaching out to me, I was finally able to take action to carve out a bright future for myself. Divorce? No way. I refuse. By the way, we know what you did too. Vanessa sharply cut off Scott, who had started to throw a tantrum as if he had a guilty conscience. He stiffened in surprise, and as if this was a signal, Mr. Miller, who had been quiet until now, started to explain the situation, saying, "We did a little investigation at the company." According to him, Scott's self-centered attitude was the same at work. He harassed subordinates who didn't do as he wanted, bullied colleagues he didn't like into resigning, and these misdeeds came to light with just a little digging by Mr. Miller. Apparently, this had already been reported to his father, the president, and there was already talk of firing Scott. No way. Divorce and getting fired from work is impossible. How am I supposed to live without a job or family? Realizing the gravity of the situation, Scott turned pale and cried out in anguish. Seeing him collapse, my mother-in-law also started to panic. "Please, both of you, don't say such strange things. Besides, Kristen has nowhere to go even if she leaves here, right? It's already decided that Kristen will be employed at his company, Mom. Give it up." At Vanessa's merciless words, both of them turned their gaze to me. "Come on, reconsider. We're husband and wife, right? If things stay like this, we won't be able to live. Help us, Kristen." I sighed deeply at the two desperately clinging to me. In the end, they just wanted to use me for their own benefit until the very end. There was no reason for me to lend a hand to such people. This is all the outcome you brought upon yourselves. Don't make me laugh by asking for help now. And so I shook them off, then left the house with Vanessa and Mr. Miller. After that, I successfully divorced Scott. With the evidence I had gathered, it was determined that the treatment I had received was terrible, and my mother-in-law was ordered to pay $30,000 in compensation. And as Mr. Miller had said, Scott was fired from the company. My mother-in-law and Scott, who had been living on inheritance and pension, are now living in poverty together, I hear. On the other hand, Vanessa cut ties with her family home and is now happily married to Mr. Miller. I also continue my relationship with her, have returned to society, and am now living a fulfilling life. From now on, I want to live. Story 5. My 6-year-old granddaughter was eating rotten bread at the dump. I called my son, who said, "We only have boys." A terrifying truth was hidden, because, what are you doing here? One early morning at the garbage dump, I saw a small girl rummaging through the trash. Her clothes were dirty, her hair was a mess, and she was eating rotten bread with single-minded focus. But when she turned to look at me, I was struck speechless with surprise because that child was my 6-year-old granddaughter. Why? This child? 2 years ago, I hurriedly contacted my son, who replied with confusion, "We've only ever had boys." After that, I would come to discover a terrifying truth unlike anything I had ever experienced before. I'm a part-time housewife who's finished raising her children. Though I was lonely after losing my police officer husband, I was enjoying a carefree retirement on my own. My son, Tim, already has his own family with 1 girl and 1 boy, kind and caring Blair and easygoing Sebastian. My adorable grandchildren. Even from a parent's perspective, They had built an exemplary, peaceful home. My house, my daughter-in-law's parents' house, and my son's family's house were all in the same city. We had a good relationship as relatives, occasionally visiting each other. If there was one thing that concerned me, it might be my son's wife, Sandra. She was what you'd call a young lady from a good family, and her parents were successful business people who owned several properties, a bit different from our ordinary family. With a different sensibility, Sandra had grown up getting everything she wanted from a young age, and even in her 30s, she still seemed to rely on her parents and others. As my son had mentioned the other day, there was a field trip for Blair's kindergarten, and since Sandra said it would be hard to take Christian by herself, I went along too. Oh, that sounds fun. Yes, but Sandra was glued to Sebastian the whole time. I know he's younger, so it can't be helped, but Blair looked a bit lonely. A father using his vacation days to participate in his child's event to reduce his wife's burden was unfamiliar in my time, but I suppose this is how modern parents are. Still, from a man's perspective, it's not a bad feeling to be relied upon. Apparently, Sandra wasn't a spoiled young lady in college, but rather a popular girl who made people want to protect her. My son was no exception, being one of those charmed by her. Since such minor things didn't interfere with daily life, neither my son nor I made a big deal out of it. But that everyday life changed dramatically in the summer when Blair was 4 and Christian was 2. When they went camping as a family, an incident occurred. Unbelievably, Blair went missing when her parents took their eyes off her for a moment. My son and his wife searched desperately, but they couldn't find Blair. Of course, I and Sandra's parents also did everything we could to find Blair. We even recruited volunteers and involved the media in a big commotion. However, unfortunately, a typhoon hit the area the day after they went camping, hampering the search. 3 days later, shoes and belongings thought to be Blair's were found downstream in the river. Of course, due to the heavy rain, the river's flow had become faster and the water level had risen. These factors led to the conclusion that Blair had passed away, and the search was regrettably called off. While the whole family was grieving, the one who never accepted it was Sandra. Please keep looking. I'll pay as much as it takes. She's definitely still alive. Her figure clinging to those around her who hesitated with words like, "We're so sorry," was pitiful to watch. It's understandable. After all, it was her first child. There's no way she could give up so easily. But still, that child is probably. Even with so many people and so much time invested, Blair couldn't be found. Even if she were found, everyone, including myself, thought she wouldn't be alive anymore. Since then, Sandra blamed herself, saying, "It's my fault that my daughter," and for a time, she fell into a very dangerous state. She hurt herself, stopped eating, couldn't go out, wouldn't speak to anyone. You still have Sebastian. If you disappear, you'll make him feel the same pain you're feeling. My son and I desperately supported and encouraged Sandra, and it took 2 years for her to recover from her despair. Christian turned 4, and Sandra rarely became depressed anymore. What? You're buying again? We just bought a toy car last week. It can wait. If you want a new one, maybe for your birthday. Christian says he wants it now. Who knows if next time will ever come. Sandra began fulfilling all of Christian's wishes and pouring money into him, as if to make up for what she couldn't do for Blair. Of course, if this continued, Christian's selfishness would only increase, and he gradually stopped listening not only to his grandparents, like me and his maternal grandparents, but even to his father, Tim. However, because of the incident with Blair, no one in the family could caution Sandra. Her parents, if anything, seemed to become even more active in providing financial support and taking care of Christian, perhaps out of pity for Sandra. I understand it can't be helped, but it feels like things are heading in a bad direction. While harboring such concerns, one day I woke up early and decided to go for a walk. While taking out the trash, come to think of it, recently the neighbors had been saying that there had been an increase in mischief, like trash bags being opened, in my area. You can put out trash from the night before, so a considerable amount of kitchen waste had been put out by early morning. Therefore, measures against crows and stray cats were thorough, so it was rumored to be the work of humans. Huh? What's that? As I was thinking about this and about to turn the corner of the street, I heard a rustling sound from the garbage dump a little distance away. I noticed a large shadow rummaging through the trash bags and instinctively stopped in my tracks. Mischief? A homeless person? This is unpleasant. What should I do? I felt compelled to do something since I had seen it. As I approached little by little, the figure gradually came into clear view. That's a person, right? A child. The sight I saw at the garbage dump, shrouded in morning mist, is one I will never forget for the rest of my life. The figure of a small child prying open the mouth of a bag and frantically stuffing rotten bread into their cheeks. "What are you doing here?" I found myself saying loudly without thinking. The child, who looked at me startled and trembling, seemed to freeze in surprise and showed no signs of running away. Her clothes and body were dirty, and her hair was unkempt. I could tell at a glance that something was not right. The child and I stared at each other for a while, saying nothing. Oh no, it's good that I called out, but what should I do next? If it were an animal, I could shoo it away, and if it were a strange person, I was planning to run away. You shouldn't eat things like this. You get sick. After thinking it over, I decided to speak in a gentle tone to try to put her at ease. However, as I approached, the child made a gesture as if covering her head and began apologizing repeatedly, saying, "I'm sorry." Hearing the same words repeated like a broken record, I was at a loss. "Calm down. I'm not angry. It's okay." As I got closer to see the child, I realized something. I recognized that child's voice and features. Have we met somewhere before? As I peered into the child's face, she seemed to sense something about me too. "Blair." "Yes, I'm Blair." Hearing her words, I gasped. This child was my granddaughter who was supposed to have died 2 years ago. "Is it really you? Are you really Blair?" She nodded in response to my question. Where had she been, and what had she been doing for 2 years? Should I report this? Various thoughts were swirling in my head, but for now, I took her to my home for protection. I kind of remember Grandma's house. After giving her food, having her take a shower, and dressing her in clean clothes, she seemed to have enough composure to reminisce about my house she hadn't visited in a long time. While I was trying my best to smile so as not to upset Blair, who had finally calmed down, I remember feeling extremely anxious inside because Blair's body was covered in marks from being hit and pinched. She should have been 6 years old at this time, but she looked short for her age and seemed underweight. Then there was something even more perplexing. Despite clearly not having been taken care of, Blair had somehow acquired a certain level of education. She understood table manners during meals and could read, write, and do simple calculations. Since a child can't acquire living habits on their own, it means she must have been living with someone all this time. I was elated to know Blair was alive, but when I thought about it, doesn't this have criminal implications? Once I thought that, I suddenly became afraid of dealing with the problem alone, so the first thing I thought to do was contact my son. "Mom, are you okay? Aren't you dreaming?" The time was 6 a.m. If you suddenly get a call from your mother early in the morning saying your granddaughter who was supposed to be dead has returned, that kind of reaction is understandable. Blair disappeared 2 years ago. We only have a boy now. Get a hold of yourself. My son's voice on the phone sounded somewhat sad and angry. I thought it was the right decision not to contact Sandra first. It would be pitiful to say something confusing just as she had finally accepted her daughter's disappearance and was starting to look forward. I wouldn't joke about something like this. Just come to my house. I almost forcibly summoned my son to the house and had him meet Blair. "Dad, Blair? Is it really you, Blair?" Seeing their reactions, I breathed a sigh of relief. Despite meeting after 2 years, Blair clearly remembered her father's face. How happy that must have made my son. "Where have you been all this time? How did you survive? Were you taken by someone? Did you escape and come here?" "Hey, don't say things that will make her anxious." My son kept asking questions that I had deliberately avoided asking. Firing off questions one after another was making Blair confused. However, contrary to such concerns, she slowly shook her head. "You know, I've been." She slowly and calmly began to speak. My son and I, who learned the whole terrifying, sad, and shocking truth, couldn't forgive the person who had tormented her for 2 years, so we decided to have them receive appropriate punishment. To avoid alerting the culprit, we entrusted Blair to someone we could trust after explaining the situation, and we continued our usual lives as if nothing had happened. For a while, we gathered collaborators and prepared for any contingencies. It was on the morning of the 5th day after rescuing Blair that I received a call from my son saying, "I found out where that person is going, Mom. I think I should go alone. After all, we don't know what might happen." "What are you saying?" At this point, the preparations are ready, so don't worry. We got into Tim's car, and headed to a certain place. That place was a villa area a little distance from my house. It was a rental villa quietly tucked away in the most inconspicuous spot among them. Dad said this one is smaller and not in a good location, so it's hard to find buyers. This villa was one of the properties owned by Sandra's parents. With mountains nearby and surrounded by dense trees, this place carved out of the forest would be perfect for hiding people or shady activities. My son and I steeled ourselves and walked towards the garage with the shutter slightly open. It was so dark inside, despite it being daytime, that we couldn't see what was in the back. However, an eerie sound of metal being dragged echoed in the dark, enclosed space. There's no doubt that person is here. The child isn't here. When I called out towards the sound, a flashlight beam suddenly illuminated my son and me. Mother-in-law, Tim, why are you here? There stood Sandra, holding a metal bat in one hand, rummaging through the garage. She's not here. I could only repeat my earlier words in a trembling voice. Even though I knew this was coming, when actually faced with it, I still felt fear because Sandra's face emerging from the darkness was so uncanny. No, I was just organizing the garage, Sandra answered without addressing the mention of she, even though we hadn't asked. Her tone of voice was normal, and her mouth was smiling, but her eyes weren't. We already know everything you've done to your own daughter. Probably by the time we came here, she must have realized that her misdeeds had been discovered. What she intended to do to whom with that bat in her hand, I don't want to think about any further. What were you planning to do to Blair with that metal bat, you devil? In contrast to me, who was hesitating, Tim confronted Sandra head-on. It's understandable given that he couldn't see his beloved daughter for 2 years, and the culprit who had kept Blair in terrible conditions was right in front of him. Devil? Me? No, she's the devil. Triggered by Tim's words, Sandra struck the bat on the floor and threw a tantrum. Sandra, why? What did Blair do to you? I had decided my first child would be a boy, but she ruined everything by being born. What? What are you talking about? What kind of nonsense is this? Listening carefully to my daughter-in-law's story, it was an utterly ridiculous and selfish reasoning. When Sandra was pregnant with Blair, she was consistently told by the doctor during regular checkups that the baby in her belly was a boy. My daughter-in-law, who had been hoping for a boy, was overjoyed and bought many baby items for boys during her pregnancy. I remember that well. However, a girl was born. Even if the gender was different from expected, a child is a child, a grandchild is a grandchild. There's no way they wouldn't be lovable. My son and I had considered it as a funny story to laugh about, but my daughter-in-law was different. I bought cute clothes and bragged to my friends, but it all went to waste, and I was embarrassed. That's just your convenience. Besides, when Sebastian was born, we could pass down the clothes we bought then to him, so nothing went to waste. It doesn't mean anything if it's not the first child. You wouldn't understand. Even I, as a woman who has experienced childbirth, couldn't understand her obsession, so it's natural that my son wouldn't understand. All the baby clothes Sebastian wore were Blair's hand-me-downs. Poor thing. But I tried, you know. I tried to accept Blair, but I just couldn't do it, my daughter-in-law said with a half-smile. I'm not cut out for patience. I've never had anything not go my way before. If she wasn't here, I could give more love to my son. Her expression as she said this with wide eyes was strangely confident, as if she were saying something completely natural. What do you mean by love? Is spending a lot of money your idea of love? That's how my parents always treated me. But don't you think I'm kind? I kept that child alive and raised her. I even educated her. I gave her a reason to live. Out of sadness and anger, I involuntarily covered my face with both hands. What Blair had told us herself was true. On that day when I discovered Blair at the garbage dump, she gradually told us what had happened to her. During the camping trip, she said she was taken to a villa by a man claiming to be Sandra's friend and ordered to stay in a makeshift living space created in the garage. How did you bring Blair here? At that time, you never left Sebastian's side, right? In this world, there are people who will do anything if you pay them enough. Of course, it would be troublesome afterwards if I did it myself. Blair had also talked about the meaning of life that Sandra wanted to give her daughter. Blair said she had to earn money for her brother and mom. That's right. I taught her that. Over 2 years. I felt nauseous at Sandra's complete lack of remorse. Is that what a mother does? That child said she thought if she worked hard to earn money, her mom would smile again. Huh. So she still thought she was loved? Sandra replied, playing with her hair as if she couldn't care less. The reason Blair had age-appropriate reading and living habits was because otherwise, she couldn't be made to earn money. Sandra really seems to think only in terms of money. No, to me, she no longer looked like a person in human form, but a monster, and it seemed Tim felt the same way. Hey, you told Blair she didn't need to learn anything else, that customers prefer stupid ones. What were you planning to make our daughter do? Do you want to know? Saying this, Sandra let out a creepy laugh. Tim, stop it. I restrained my son, who was about to grab Sandra. Even if she's this kind of person, if we lay hands on her first, it would put my son at a disadvantage. I was also full of the desire to lunge at her, but I decided to hold back here. But that brat really has no guts. Just because I skipped bringing food for 3 days, would a normal person go rummaging through garbage? I failed. I never thought she could go that far on her own. Sandra grumbled in frustration, which was nothing short of abnormal. Stop it. How could you say such terrible things? You guys asked, didn't you? Besides, doesn't everyone throw away things they don't need? Her attitude of speaking as if it were common sense really angered me. Her parents are said to be decent people, so how did such a monster come to be? We'll turn you over to the police. Be prepared to face the law. Huh? What are you talking about? Of course, you, Blair, and everyone else will have to disappear. As soon as she said this, Sandra took out a lighter from her pocket and pointed it towards a nearby car. Looking closely, gasoline was leaking from the car body, wetting the floor. You idiot. Stop this foolishness. That's right. If you do that, even you. Shut up. Sandra hit the car body with the bat, causing a large dent and more gasoline to drip. If things don't go my way, it's better if everyone becomes charred and disappears. Sandra shouted while laughing loudly, clearly out of her mind. Persuasion is no longer possible. There's no choice. I softened my expression and spoke gently to Sandra. I understand. It must have been hard for you all alone. I'll be on your side, so please put down the lighter. Mom? What are you saying? When I gave a subtle eye signal to my surprised son, he seemed to understand my intention. Sandra, I'm sorry. I apologize. We won't tell anyone. We'll do as you say, so please help us. When Tim also showed signs of complying with Sandra, she smiled with satisfaction. Put your hands behind your back. Sit facing the wall. As we did as she said, Sandra slowly started walking, not taking her eyes off us. Where's Blair? She's with my friend. She's at the house 2 doors down from ours. The moment Sandra stood at the entrance of the garage, at Tim's signal, sturdy older men who had been hiding nearby all rushed to restrain Sandra at once. They shouted, secured, caught in the act, while swiftly subduing Sandra. What is this? Let go of me. These people are retired former police officers, all friends of my husband. They've remained close to me even after my husband passed away. When I told them about my granddaughter's situation, they agreed to cooperate fully. Actually, my pocket had contained a mobile phone in an ongoing call the whole time. The phone was connected to these friends. They were the ones who said, to ensure Blair doesn't return to her mother's custody, let's gather solid evidence. All of our exchanges have been recorded, and there are this many witnesses. Stop your unsightly behavior now. It will only make your crime more severe. Shut up, you old hag. You think you can do this to me and get away with it? I'm going to tell Daddy and Mommy. I was so dumbfounded by her textbook villainous words that I couldn't find a response. Hey, Tim, don't you feel anything seeing your wife like this? Help me. I'm the mother of your child. I can only feel hatred for you now. We don't need a mother who torments her children. Tim was straightforward, showing no lingering affection for the woman he once loved. No way. Mother-in-law, Blair won't abandon me, right? She said she'd work hard for me. Besides, taking a child away from their mother, are you serious? Do you really think such emotional blackmail will work? I wish she hadn't turned to me here, but perhaps she thought I might still be swayed as a fellow mother. She underestimated me. There are many children who forgive their parents, no matter how terribly they're treated. Blair is kind, so she probably still likes you. That's right. That's right, mother-in-law. I knew you'd understand because we're both mothers. Stop it. Don't lump me in with you. I looked straight at Sandra with a serious gaze. Blair had her existence erased for 2 years, her rights taken away, unloved and alone. She's just a 6-year-old girl. As I spoke, I desperately held back the tears that threatened to come. I should have searched more thoroughly. I should have noticed Sandra's abnormality. If I had, we might have been able to save Blair earlier. For Blair's sake, we can't forgive you. Everything you tried to do to her will now come back to you. What? What do you mean? When you return, there will be no one waiting for you. You'll lose your home, family, and friends. You'll be unloved, eventually forgotten, and meet a lonely end. Hearing this, Sandra's face instantly turned pale, and she began to cry. Considering what you did to Blair and what you were planning to do, it's only natural retribution. By this time, active police officers had arrived. They exchanged salutes with my friends and dragged away the screaming Sandra. Blair's physical condition, testimony, and the recorded evidence were decisive, and Sandra was arrested. She ended up spending some time behind bars. My son divorced her and gained custody, demanding a lump sum payment of $20,000 in compensation and $150,000 in child support, all of which was paid. Sandra's parents also apologized. They said, "We made a mistake in raising our daughter. We won't be involved with her anymore," and sold their properties to move to a distant state. My son and I also moved to a new place and are living a new life. Blair has started attending kindergarten and is now happily surrounded by kind friends and teachers. Blair, who is looking forward to starting elementary school, and cute Christian, who follows her around. I intend to continue showering them both with lots of love.